This is Duke University.
So I'm trying to understand that these folks are buying land to put their mobile homes on and just not having the resources to pay for the septic because it's so expensive here because of the, so is it a resource problem or is it an access problem?
It's both. It's both because in some cases the people already own the land. It was family property and they're putting a home there. And they can't go and get the funding. The funding sources should be USDA, and also in some states like North Carolina, through the state revolving loan system, you can actually borrow the money. They don't do that in Alabama. What happens is that it's up to the homeowner to find the money, and the average homeowner don't make the salary to equate to what it would cost to buy a septic system. So that's part of the problem. Then the other part of the problem, we found that where they have sewage, one of the communities, they have a lagoon. The lagoon overflows, and it actually overflows through these people's backyards across the street. For that particular home, the people that were tested there tested positive for all three of those parasites that I mentioned. And they're paying a sewage fee, and they're connected to the sewage. So as a lot of it is a lack of regulation, a lack of policies in place to control these kinds of things. And then instead of dealing with in cases like the people that did the spray irrigation system, they won't deal with that, but they'll deal with a homeowner. In the case of the guy in Brundage, we think that there are a lot of issues around that. One of the things is there's a developer who wants to buy his property because they want to put a truck stop over there. And the developer has since bought the property next door to his property, where the church is bought the property next door, and that property has the road that accesses the church. So they're really trying to box them in and get them to sell, but you can't use that as a factor to do it. We feel that we have to help him, because if we don't help him, they can start arresting people in Lowndes County again. So a lot of it is lack of resources, and then there's just some terrible policies in place that are not conducive to helping. And then USDA, we were told by one of our U.S. senators that USDA sends money back to Washington every year. So instead of putting it into these problems and trying to solve them, we've actually talked to the director for USDA, and he said to us basically is that the septic systems cost too much. So until you come up with a cheaper option, we're not going to spend any money on it. So what do we do? So those are the kinds of issues that we're dealing with. So it's kind of complicated. You have, on one hand, the homeowners who may buy the property, can't afford it. We think that if they get a septic system or a house, if you buy a house from USDA, and they're not funding a lot of houses in Alabama, but if the way their policies are, if you buy a house and you need a septic system, they're supposed to finance it in with the purchase. Now, if you buy a mobile home, that's a different story. And we feel that if you buy a mobile home, they should also finance the septic system in with the purchase. But I guess they're afraid to do that because that could be half the price of the mobile home, and then you come and get the mobile home, if the person doesn't pay for it, you can't take the septic tank. So I think that's one of the reasons why they won't do it. So it's complicated, but we feel that there are monies that come from EPA that go to the state every year. And we have found that those monies are not equitably dispersed throughout the state. They're given to the wealthier communities. I had an example in my prepared speech about a community, I think it's called Coleman. Coleman, for an example, got a loan for $2 million to upgrade its system. Hayneville, which is a small, poor black town, was approved for a loan for $700,000. The Coleman loan was forgiven, but they wanted the Hayneville people to pay the loan back. That's not fair, because it discourages the small towns from applying, because they don't have the money to pay it back. The only way they can do it is pass it on to the consumers. And the consumers can't afford it either. So we're kind of at a standstill. And there are a variety of policies that need to change on the state level as well as on the local level.
I just had a question about the economy of the county that you're discussing. Was there a primary source of income? Yeah.
The largest employer was the school system, but there are people that've been working for the school system for about, that are not teachers, that have been working there and for the county for, I know one person's working for 20 years and her income may have been $20,000, $25,000 a year. And that's on the high end for some people. But if 23% of the people live below the poverty level, and then you have their 2 tier 1 suppliers to Hyundai that we were able to recruit into the area, but most of the people that they employ are not from Lowndes County. At one point, GE's largest plastic factory was located in Lowndes County. I think they've sold it now to another company, but the largest plastic factory in the world was in Lowndes County. Most of their employees did not come from Lowndes County. They let these places come and locate in those communities tax-free. So GE, I think they were part of their recruiting them in, they were like 30 years tax-free. So when it was time to tax them, they didn't know how to tax them because they had never been in there to assess what they had in the factory. So that's part of the problem as well. And then the types of industries that they've been trying to recruit lately have been like coal-fired furnaces and the things like that that will add to the problem instead of subtract from the problem. And landfills, that's been another big one because they wanted to put a landfill along the Selma to Montgomery Marsh Trail, and people protested that. So the economics, most people travel. Last night I looked at the most recent census, and the population has decreased. When we started working, the population was almost 14,000. Now there are about 10,000 people in the county. People have left because it's too expensive to stay there. Most young people, if you graduate from high school and college, they either join the military or to get away, or they go and move somewhere else. And there are no jobs for them. So I think that keeps the area poor. But we also feel that in terms of looking at a solution, when we put in place some type of sewage treatment, it has to be something that can also encourage economic development, because it's going to continue to keep the areas poor. Because without the proper sewage treatment, they're not going to recruit businesses that can provide jobs, et cetera. Or even to people taking advantage of all the history in the area from the Selma to Montgomery March. When they come there, most time they can't stay in the county. They got to stay in Selma, they got to stay in Montgomery. And I talked to a person once who was working with the Economic Development Office out of Atlanta, the regional office, and his area was Alabama. And I was talking to him about putting some investment in the Lowndes County to help recruit businesses there. And he's told me the only reason to go through Lowndes County was to go to Selma or to Montgomery. So, people with that mindset, they don't care about, they have the ability to put the monies in the place to promote economic development, but it's not one of the favorite areas because it's mostly black and poor. There are a lot of people that don't have septic systems there. I mean, if they were to arrest, just based on our study, we know of at least 300 places with raw sewage on the ground in Lowndes County. Just imagine they went to all these homes and arrested at least one person. Where would they house them? There's no place, and that's just not Lowndes County. The health department officials acknowledge that this problem is in all 67 counties. So what we're finding, sometimes it's neighbors that's reporting them. One instance we found that a young lady bought a house. The house was 8 years old. She worked at a bank. She purchased this home. It went through inspection and everything. And if you look at the house, it looks like it has a septic system. It doesn't. So the neighbors who had the adjoining property behind her, it was a pasture, and they had cattle in the pasture. And they reported to the health department saying that she didn't have a septic system and their cattle was walking through it. Well, didn't they know that when the house was for sale? That would have been the time to say something, to say you need to fix it before you sell this property. But they had just passed on the responsibility to her. And even the health officials, because they called me about that one too. When they called me, they said, it's not fair. We've done everything we could to see if we could hold the previous owners responsible for this, but there's nothing that we can do. There's nothing in the policies that will allow us to require that that if you're selling property, you have to disclose this. And I said, well, how can you tell then whether or not a house has a septic system? They said now they require that there is some type of lid that they have to put in place that they can look at and inspect. I said, so you mean a house that was built prior to you having this policy, there's no way for you to know? So you just have to trust that it's there. So again, a lot of it goes back to policies that were put in place that just don't work, and they won't change them, and we have to force them to do that.
So you mentioned litigation as a future action. I was wondering where you're aiming the litigation at. Will it be county, state level, federal? And what are you hoping to gain from that action?
The litigation would be aimed at the Alabama Department of Environmental Management, because the monies that come into the state come from EPA, goes through that entity, and we're finding that a lot of the problems that are being caused, especially like the spray field irrigation, that was approved by ADEM. They won't do anything to change it. And recently, we were invited to a meeting that. I think they have a commission that oversees ADEM, and now you can't even speak at the commission meetings unless you submit a request, and then you got to tell them what you're going to talk about before they approve you. And I understand they were debating this past week to cut that out. So there's no community involvement with this, and we want to change that. ADEM was founded in, I think, the late 1970s, and based on what we know so far systematically, they have excluded communities of color and poor communities from the disbursement of the funds. And these are federal funds.
So do you see like some of the primary issues, and maybe they're very different across contexts, as being just a total lack of infrastructure? Like you were mentioning, like there's not an infrastructural plan in Lowndes County. Or an issue of just sort of like what you've been hearing about at the national level, like crumbling infrastructure resulting in sewage overflows and those sorts of things, or a combination of?
It's a combination of both. In places like Lowndes County, there was no infrastructure to start with. And then there are places like, any city. There was I think last year there was an article in the New York Times that talked about the storm runoff. Usually when we have these downpours, it shuts down the systems, and then there's just the waste, instead of being treated, is actually going into the drinking water source. People don't realize that. So it's just that it's not seen because it's so big, and we do have some infrastructure in place, whereas in places like Lowndes County, it's real obvious because it's like going into another world. You would not expect these conditions. Even I grew up in Lowndes County. When I grew up in Lowndes County, we didn't have running water. Most homes didn't have that. We didn't even have telephones when I was a kid there.
In regards to finding a cheaper sanitation system, are there any other places you're looking at for models, or how are you going about doing that?
We have another partner that I failed to mention, is Dr. Joe Brown, who was once with the London School of Hygiene and Tropical Medicine, who happened to be a native of Selma, Alabama. And he's now at Georgia Tech, and he said that they are making their lab available to us to even create something that could possibly work if there's something that does not work. But I've asked him for assistance in terms of the technology because he has manned a lot of projects for gates around the world. And I can't believe that they're using raised beds in some of those countries and charging people outrageous amounts of money to do that. So he's going to be helping to write part of the plan that we will ultimately turn into EPA to talk about the other kinds of technologies that exist there.
Huge. Like, how are you going to get rid of the sewage in these areas? Because like this, I mean, if you find a system to fix like what's causing the problem, but what are you going to do with like the after effects of like the water pollution and that sort of thing?
Well, what we're hoping to do is with the plan, well, when we went from house to house and we got the facts on whether or not a person has a sewage system, we also use GPS tracking where they're going to be trapped, they're going to be placed on a map so we can see what the settlement patterns are. In some places we're going to have cluster systems. In some places, they're so far away you have to have an individual system. In terms of cleaning up the sewage that's already there, I think ultimately a lot of it is on top of the ground and not really going into a water source. Now, the picture that's now being shown, that's actually going into a water source. We're going to have to work with people on trying to alleviate that. And we were just called about that a few weeks ago. That was our first time going to Uniontown, Alabama, and dealing with one that was created by a state-approved entity, because the state had to approve that for them to be able to build it in the first place, and they monitor it. So we are hoping that at some point we'll be able to work with them on addressing that problem. And then for those communities, once there's a system for them to connect to, then the sewage won't be on the ground. I guess in terms of alleviating, we'll have to work with some people to determine what's the best way to cover it up or alleviate where there's been a constant or chronic problem where it's been running there for years and years, and see whether or not there's a way that we can remedy that situation. And that's why I think testing is also very important, because we need to know what's out there, what kind of pathogens could very well be in the ground, so we can make a case for getting rid of it.
I'm wondering whether there are models that you're looking at for even a larger strategy. I mean, I know it's really important to focus on your local area, but as we think about this, you think about sort of a class action kind of effort, because it's happening in rural African American poor communities across the United States, or indigenous communities, people who lack that kind of power to make a difference. So if you were to do something like that, would it be focused on the USDA? Would it be focused on the EPA? What might a bigger strategy look like? And are you looking at models of other things that have worked as a way to see possibilities?
Well, it's interesting that you would ask that question. One of the things I'm looking at, I just haven't convinced a group of lawyers to go along with it yet, but I think that we should look at how USDA has funded wastewater treatment. And I think that we will find a pattern that existed very similar to the way in which they did not fund black farmers. The current proposed litigation would deal with the state of Alabama, but it would be filed in federal court because the federal monies are being used. And it could very well open the door for change throughout the region. Because I'm sure that there are other, besides Alabama, that we're going to see the same thing throughout the South. Some states are a little bit more progressive than others.
Given that next year, right, is the 50th anniversary of the Selma to Montgomery March, and that's going to get a lot of attention, are you also thinking about ways that means, or ways that we can tell people about? I mean, I know there's going to be a celebration. People are going to make that walk again, and that may be an opportunity for folks to know more about what's happening in Lowndes County.
Well, I hope so, because we've been trying to do this for the last 12 years, and they make the walk every 5. I know. I actually went out on the walk when they had one after Alabama passed that really regressive immigration law, and they had a march from Selma to Montgomery against that particular policy. So I got pictures like these pictures. I blew them up and went out on the march with some of the people that's working with me in the community. And we joined the march in Lowndes County, and there were people there like, I'll call names, Jesse Jackson, Al Sharpton. Actually, Al Sharpton's people tried to put me out of the march because they didn't want to focus on that. Jesse walked up to me and said, "What is this?" I said, "It's raw sewage." I said, "People here living amongst raw sewage." He said, "Oh, that's nasty," and he walked off. It's the truth. And the only person that gave me some attention was being jealous. And we were having a meeting that night, and he wanted to come. But his Southeast Regional Director said, "No, you need to be in Selma, I'll go." And he went. And one of the pictures where I told you where the communications director was holding his nose, that was during that march, because he went back to see it for himself. So they are aware of it, but the litigation the proposed litigation will involve the not only NRDC, but also the NAACP Legal Defense Fund. So every time we go to the county government, for an example, to talk about this, they say, we're waiting to see what the state is going to do. They're passing the buck, so to speak. Alabama, the interesting thing is in a lot of these communities, they're represented by African-American people that have no kind of power whatsoever. And there was recently an article that you may want to look up in the New Republic, and it called Reverse Civil Rights. And in the article, they interviewed a number of elected officials who are supposed to be powerful in Alabama, but to show you how powerful they were, and I'm a straight shooter, so I don't get along too well with a lot of politicians there, but they bought into a plan to reapportion Alabama, because you know every 10 years after the census they redraw the lines and which determine who represents which areas. And it's even more defined now because, you know, we are definitely a red state. I don't even know whether we have any blue pockets in Alabama. But anyway, they redrew the lines, and the black representatives in the House and the Senate signed off on it because they were only concerned about conserving their own positions, preserving their own positions. As a result, they have set it up so Alabama will be controlled, the House and the Senate is going to be controlled by the GOP for the next 10 years, probably longer. Why is that a problem? Well, it's a problem because now they want to challenge it and say it's a violation of the Voting Rights Act, but the black elected officials signed off on it. A lot of people, even the elected officials that we've been dealing with, don't want to deal with this. The help that we've gotten, strangely enough, the help that we've gotten has come from the person that sponsored the appropriation that funded the study that we're doing now. The appropriation was part of the 2002 budget. It took us to 2010 to get it. When I went to the young lady's house who had the sewage outside her back door, I took an Associated Press reporter with me. And then I contacted Senator Jeff Sessions, who is a U.S. Senator, who's, I think he's a ranking Republican in the Senate. I contacted his office to tell them that they were getting ready to start arrests again. He wrote a letter to EPA, and EPA finally released the funds. He wanted to know why it was taking so long after 8 years to release the funds. But they were not only holding up the funds for these were national demonstration projects. They were not only holding up funds for us, there were others that were funded across the country, and they had held up their money as well. They were hoping that we would just go away. But as a result of that person writing that letter, we were able to get the funding. So a lot of times what I found in doing this work is that I try to find out the backgrounds of the people that I'm dealing with. And if we have a similar background, it doesn't matter what the political party is, because sometimes the people you assume will help you won't, and the ones you think will not help you will. Montgomery, which has the same kind of soils, they don't have the problem because they have a sewage system that was paid for but with public monies. That's the difference. In the rural communities, of course, that it's out of sight, out of mind. You don't have the funds, the resources to put it in place. Even in Lowndes County, now if you go closer to the Alabama River, I understand that at one point it used to be a sea. And the sand there, the soil there is sandy and it drains better. So the difference is that the septic system in that part, I've gotten to the point now where I tell people, if you want to buy property, you need to look up the soil conditions and find out, because the place with the worst soils is going to cost more, because the septic system could cost an astronomical amount of money. Whereas if you go to Lounsboro in Lowndes County, where the soils are different, then your septic system may cost $2,500, which is a big difference between $2,500 and upwards of $30,000. Just to give you one more example, we were working with a mobile home company, and they told us that Kid Rock bought a mobile home from them in the Dothan area because he likes to go hunting. So he had bought this big mobile home, but he had to pay $20,000 for his septic system, and he was complaining about it. So just imagine if he was complaining about the cost, the average person can't afford it.
And so the bad soils for septic would be the clayey ones?
In our case, it's the clays, because the clays hold water, and they expand and contract. And we all not only find that being a problem with it will break open a septic tank and bend field lines, because depending on the weather, it expands and contracts. To give you an example, in Montgomery, where I live, houses that are sitting on this type of soil, you have a lot of cracked foundations. And if you ever lived in a house with a cracked foundation, you can tell by the cracks in the ceiling and so forth. And that kind of soil is not good for these on-site systems that we have to use in the rural communities.
Because I'm just trying to get a sense of the communities in which you work, how much do they come together around this issue? Do they self-organize? Have they tried to come up with community solutions? What types of mobilizations taking place? Are the churches active?
And we've been doing this work for 12 years. When we first got started, when I first got started in this effort, we organized community meetings where we actually held hearings, and we had a court reporter who documented what people were saying. And we kind of patterned it after the meetings that occurred during the voting rights effort. And they were held in different churches in different districts around the county. And we went to those same churches because of their history of activism, and we wanted a place where people could feel comfortable and come and talk about these things. And that's how we found out not only about we organized over the sewage issue, but that's when they started talking about the power bills, which were among the highest in the country. And we were able to eventually rectify that problem as well. But from that, we put together a plan for a wastewater management entity called the Black Belt Water and Sewer Authority, which we put together all the components of that. And what made it different from the other kinds of wastewater management entities is that we had people in each of the communities to meet at these churches, and they nominated the persons who would represent them on this management entity. The problem was that the money that we originally was going to get from EPA was going to go into that entity. And because they took so long, people start losing interest. So what we've done is continued the battle, because we knew that it wasn't going away, although the arrests had stopped at that time. Now, 12 years later, the arrests are starting again, and this is becoming more of an issue. What we've done in terms of connecting with other communities, actually we're planning for December to pull together other communities like Uniontown, because they have their own entity that they've organized to fight not only the sewage problem there, they're also fighting, they're receiving coal ash there in their landfill, and they said there's a cheese factory that's causing problems as well. So the community, they said they've gone about as far as they could go, and they want to align with other people. So what we're doing now with them and the Alabama Water Alliance, we're going to come together in December and plan an entity and plan a meeting, and then out of that we hope to develop an entity or a collaboration where all of us can come together, because what I'm finding is that people are working their own silos in their own community, but we got the same problem. So yes, we are trying to work with other groups outside the names that I've mentioned, but a lot of community efforts have happened in isolation of what we do, and we see the need now to bring everybody together, because that way we all have limited resources and we can share those.
I want just to thank Catherine for taking the time to speak with us today. It was really wonderful and informative.
Thank you. Thank you for inviting me.
Produced by Duke University. Online at duke.edu.